This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review. Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review, a program dedicated to the word, to thought and debate, brought to you by the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute, which promotes humanistic, democratic, and liberal values in the social discourse in Israel. I'm Dahlia Shenlin.
And I'm Gilad Halpern. And we'll be talking here every week about literature and research and ideas and other things of interest. Our guest today is a senior research fellow in philosophy at St. Benet's Hall, University of Oxford, and the editor of a new book entitled Words of Fire, Achad Ha'am and the Jewish Future, a collection of essays by the early 20th century essayist and Zionist theorist, most notably remembered as the, quote, father of cultural Zionism. The book was recently published by Notting Hill Editions. Dr. Brian Klug, hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review.
Hello, it's a pleasure to be here.
So let's start by way of introduction in explaining Achad Ha'am's contribution to the debate. What is exactly cultural Zionism and how was it, and is it still different from other forms of Zionism that we know?
Well, in the early days, there were essentially two forms of Zionism. One was the political Zionism of Theodor Herzl, and the other was the cultural Zionism of Achad Ha'am. There was also something called practical Zionism, which Achad Ha'am himself had been involved in, but he was a critic because he wanted to emphasize what he called the spiritual renewal of Judaism. His main focus was on reviving Judaism in the modern era in a new form that enables it to kind of come back to life, as opposed to Herzl's emphasis on questions of state and governance and constitutionality and so on. So the difference really is a difference between those two is a difference in emphasis. In those days, religious Zionism hardly existed. There were some voices prior to both Achad Ha'am and Herzl in the 19th century that were rabbinical and that were looking towards some Zionism in some sense. But one also has to be careful here about the use of the word because we use it anachronistically. It wasn't coined until 1892 by Nathan Birnbaum. And so in a way to talk about Zionism before that time is just slightly problematic. And Achad Ha'am himself had a kind of complicated relationship to the word itself. I mean, he sometimes uses the word Zionist to talk about himself, and at other times he talks about the Zionists.
With distance.
Distancing,
yeah.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
You know, this is interesting. I think that one of the premises of your book is that everybody remembers Achad Ha'am for cultural Zionism. But you also say we forget about all sorts of other aspects of Achad Ha'am's thinking. And reading through the essays, might characterize him as a philosopher of humankind in a way. You know, and I want to know, what do you think really has been left out of his legacy? Well,
I like that very much. It has never occurred to me. But I think you could say that he is a kind of philosopher of humankind with a focus on the Jewish people. And if you look at it that way, it puts his Zionism in a completely different context. I think this question is related to the previous point about anachronism. There's a tendency to read the present back into the past and fail to understand what that past was like. In fact, the word Zionism refers to many different ideas, movements, impulses, aspirations. And in Achad Ha'am's case, it was very much linked to what you might call a universal vision. With other people, it's the opposite. You know, and the fact that a certain kind of Zionism has become fairly dominant today, though there's more than one kind, which tends to emphasize separatism and particularism at the expense of the universal, can lead us to forget the range of ideas that existed in the earlier days, and Achad Ha'am in particular, because he gets folded into the narrative. And now you have all these streets named after him in Tel Aviv, in Petah Tikva, and Ramat Gan, and elsewhere.
But it's a very hip street in Tel Aviv.
He got a good deal.
In fact, funnily enough, my mother's cousins bought a house on Rehov Achad Ha'am in, I think it was the 20s or 30s, and they built that house themselves, and they lived there for many years, as it happens. So, I'm prepared to accept that it's a very hip street in Tel Aviv. Yeah. But I think what happens is Achad Ha'am becomes an icon of the movement and then of the state. And
Appropriated as it is.
Appropriated, exactly. And part of the point of this book is not so much to reappropriate as to release him from that box. Because at one and the same time, this honors him, but it also in a way buries him. Because then his voice is lost, except as a voice that is somehow part of the state's official narrative about itself. So that's part of the point of the book, to try and...
Yeah, I know. I'm just trying to understand.
Yeah.
You said, part of the reason for that is probably because Ahad Zionism and Herzl Zionism weren't mutually exclusive. I mean, they could be,
Sure.
to an extent, complementary. Were they really? And did it happen? I mean, looking back at the course of the history of the evolution of Zionism, what was really the interplay between the two?
The interplay came through other people, like Weizmann. I mean, Weizmann, who was a friend and fan of Ahad, in a way sought to marry the two. And the democratic faction within the political Zionist movement, which had been led by Herzl, was one in which Ahad was brought in to, so to speak, spiritualize the political Zionism of Herzl and Nordau and others like them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it sounds like you're saying he was sort of breathing life into this political state project. But I want to I want to go back to what you said before about the kind of life he was breathing into this political project, this tension between the particularist and the universal. You make the point that he, in a way, holds a kind of anti-nationalist nationalism about Zionism. And I just want to quote a couple of things that I think illustrate something about this contradiction. At one point, you quote him saying, "Strive for nothing except to make every phase of life an embodiment of the idea of justice, and we are not superior to other nations, even in the sphere of morality." These sound like very universal principles and a little bit out of step with where Israel is today.
Well, yes. I mean, the last point you've raised is really a springboard for a whole conversation about where Israel is today, and also the whole debate about the Jewish future in the Jewish world beyond Israel. But as regards this contradiction that you're talking about, I think it's a tension rather than a contradiction. And I think the tension arises from his vision of what is particular about the Jewish people. So on the one hand, he's a nationalist in the sense that he emphasizes the nation and the future of the nation and the revival of the nation. On the other hand, in his view, at the heart of this nation's being, you might say, is a universal mission, the mission of promoting justice. That, for him, is the heart of the whole matter. And if the movement, the Zionist movement, fails to instantiate that and to promote that, then as far as he's concerned, it's a failure. It's not what it was. It's not a revival or renewal of the spirit of the people.
But there were, I think, quite a few pitfalls there that he may have been able to avoid. He finds inspiration in all sorts of romantic theorists of the nation, such as Herder and others that you also spent some time writing on in this book. And we all know how that ended. I mean, the fact that the nation has its own transcendental spirit, and however you want to call it. Didn't he really? I mean, his theory of Zionism opened the door to this kind of, folkist, anti-humanistic currents within the Israeli or Zionist nation?
Well, this is a very good question. And I think here it's important to, in my view, to pay close attention to the context of the time. At the time that Ahad was writing, it was a period of what you might call the rise of ethnic nationalism in Europe. And the way I read him, he casts about for resources with which to articulate the vision that he has of the future for the Jewish people, rather than being a theorist. I mean, rather than being a political theorist who comes with a theory that he then applies to the Jewish people. So although you're right about the influence of Johann Gottfried Herder and his romantic ethnic nationalism, which was very important for the Slavic nationalist movements, for example, and others, and you can see its influence, and commentators talk about that in early Zionism, he was also influenced by Herbert Spencer. And when you read his writings, there's a lot of talk about the struggle that goes on between nations, which is a Spencerian and even Darwinian way of talking. So what does that mean? Does it mean that he's conflicted? Because you can't put Herbert Spencer and Herder together. They're two quite different thinkers, and politically they go in different directions. And my answer to that is, no, he's simply drinking at whatever well he can in order to get the language that he needs to put into words what he's trying to say about the revival of the Jewish people. Ultimately, it's Jewish sources that he turns to.
Well, that's interesting you talk about Jewish sources, because I've noticed that he quotes, he draws on many, many European sources. I mean, he's got Adam Smith, he's got Coleridge, he's got Goethe. Is he, in a way, too European for the Israel that came into being?
That is, again, another fascinating question, because you could argue that, and this isn't only true of Ahad Ha'am, I think this is a question about the whole movement insofar as it was a European movement. And it applies to Herzl, of course, with his vision of Alt Newland and so on. To what extent were European Jews projecting onto Palestine, onto Zion, a European idea, a European ideal? I think that can be said about him. Stephen Zipperstein, in his authoritative biography, makes the point, and I'm not going to remember this accurately, but he makes the point that in a way Ahad Ha'am's ideal of the revival of Jewish national life was realized in Odessa, not in Tel Aviv. And when he came to Tel Aviv in 1922, for the last few years of his life, Zipperstein suggests that what he was trying to do was to reproduce the world of Odessa, which was a Haskalah world, a world of Jewish enlightenment, with people like Bialik and others, and of course Leon Pinsker, and so on before him. And so this point is a really, I think, again, it's another place where you could have a springboard for a discussion about Israel today and the future.
But conversely, or at the same time, or whatever, in a way, he won, because when you look at world Jewry today, most of them are Zionists without even having anything to do with the state polity of Israel, other than some other, some kind of emotional attachment to it. Wasn't it exactly what he was aiming for?
Well, that's a good observation. I mean, what does it mean, though, to say that people are Zionist or not Zionist?
And are they Ahad Ha'am Zionists all around all those diaspora Jews we're talking about?
At least they define themselves as Zionists.
Well, I mean, there was a recent poll in England conducted by, I think, Queen Mary College of, not a poll, but a survey of opinion amongst Jews. And according to that, something like 60% did define themselves as Zionist, of British Jews. But over 93% said something about the importance of Israel to them without calling themselves Zionist. So the point I would make in this connection is, whether we use the word Zionist or not, the fact is that the rank and file of Jews resonate, right, to the whole project in some shape or form. Some very critically, right, like myself, and others. But nonetheless, it means something to us. And that, I think, is a good way of connecting today with Ahad Ha'am in the past.
Because when you say it's really his main accomplishment in his true legacy?
I'm not sure I would put it quite that way. I would say that it points the direction of where his legacy lies.
I have to jump in and raise a slight disagreement with Gilad on this, and I want to ask your opinion of what you would think. How can you judge in this, in this disagreement? It seems to me that the kind of Zionism that people around the world are supporting is, again, that Israel is in some way meaningful to them, as your survey put it, but that he is advancing a very nuanced understanding of nationalism, as you put it, and we might characterize it today in political science, where I come from, as liberal nationalism. Do you think that's the Zionism that people around the world are supporting? And in that sense, if it's not, can we say that Ahad Ha'am really won?
Well, of course, there are a lot of people around the world, and it's hard. It's
hard. We're talking about Jews
We're talking
who
about
identify
Jews,
with
but then
Israel.
it's even harder.
Of course.
There are even more opinions.
Yeah.
But no, I think seriously, I think that when we put things in political scientific terms, it sometimes leaves out a lot of people from the conversation. And it maybe helps to just try and talk in almost in sort of ordinary language about what people are feeling and how they're responding. Now, I want to come back to your statement that most Jews are Zionists. I don't think I can go along with that because of the problematic nature of the word Zionist.
No, but they have an attachment to Israel.
But in that sense, some kind of attachment, yes, or some kind of special connection, even, as I say, if it's a reaction against what Israel is doing. And what I would say for many Jews, and maybe this is what you were getting at, that has to do with an idea, not... For some, it is just a matter of Israel as a Jewish state, and it's a kind of, if you'll forgive me for putting it this way, it's a kind of chauvinist attachment. But for many Jews, it's not chauvinist. It's about a sense of what Judaism is about. And this is where I think Ahad Ha'am's maybe main legacy is, that he goes to what he sees as the heart of Judaism, and that, as I was saying earlier, for him is the pursuit of justice. It's the prophetic message.
I wanted to ask you now about his pen name, Ahad Ha'am, meaning man of the people. Where did it come from? And it actually says a lot, but how does it really transpire in his thinking, in his writing?
What exactly he says is a matter of disagreement among people, but I take the view that it sums him up. And because, to answer your last point, what does it say about his writing, is that right? Is that all the time as I read him, he is writing precisely as Ahad Ha'am, as one of the people, not as an academic, not as a political scientist, not even as an essayist. And now this is an interesting point. I talk about this in the introductory essay. Because he's a sublime essayist. And this was actually one of the main reasons why the publisher approached me and wanted to publish his essays. They wanted to bring his essays to a wider audience, take him out of the Jewish fold, because they're not a Jewish publisher, although the founder was Jewish, partly because he's just such a good essayist. He's a master of the form.
But he says, I'm not a writer.
He says, I'm not a writer, exactly. Where does the name come from? Not quite the first. Yes, it was. It was the first article that he wrote. Not This Way, I think in English. It's something like that. In 1889.
Lo zo haderech.
Lo ze haderech. Thank you. In 1889. Thank you. And he says that he used the pen name. Asher Ginsberg was the name he was given, but he uses the pen name Ahad Ha'am, because he says he's writing not as an essayist, but as one of the people. And so this is a paradox, because he is an essayist. Almost everything he writes is in the form of an essay, and he's brilliant at it. My answer to this, my solution or resolution of this paradox, is that he, precisely because he doesn't think of himself as an essayist per se, he is truly an essayist, because he has something to say to an intended audience. And I think that that's really what an essayist ultimately is about. And so, as I think I say in the introduction, I might mangle this, but writing essays was not his raison d'etre. His raison d'etre led him to be an essayist. What I say is much more succinct in print, but it's something like that. It's because of who he was that he wrote essays. And who was he? He was Ahad Ha'am. He was one of the people. That's why that phrase, I think, is so significant, and why I think it sums him up. He's all the time writing as one of the people to his people, but his message, if you like, has a much wider reach.
Well, that's why it's hard to talk about him and not get into some of the more universal issues that he raises. And if you'll allow, I would love to delve into some of the actual material in the essays. And I'll start with a question about the essay Positive and Negative, because it reminded me in an interesting way of a classic text from philosophy of science, Thomas Kuhn's Structure of Scientific Revolutions, where he talks about the accumulation of small changes and knowledge that lead to big changes in thinking in the hard science, in the natural sciences. Yeah. Do you think that that Ahad Ha'am in a way describes a process of change in human thought, social norms, and religious thinking that mirrors in a way the natural sciences and how we learn and change?
Well, I think I've never thought of that, but I do think there's something in that. First of all, he's not a revolutionary in the sense of someone who advocates violent change or even sudden change. He believes in a gradual transformation of things. And his message constantly to the movement, as it were, is be patient, don't rush it, and so on. Secondly, he was clearly a kind of a convert, if you like, to natural science, because he grew up in a Hasidic environment. We can maybe talk about that later. But he comes to the European Enlightenment and the Jewish Enlightenment, the Haskalah, with a kind of scientific cast of mind, but not in the narrow sense. It's not a reductionist, materialist science. scientific cast of mind. It's not scientism, but it's what you were saying. It's this approach of analyzing a phenomenon, breaking it down into its constituent parts. He even uses that kind of language at certain points in order to understand it. In that sense, scientific. And also one other thing in connection, no mystification. So this brings me back to your question earlier about Herder, right?
Mine,
Yeah, your question. Your question about Herder, because these two things I think go together. And my answer, I think, bridges them both. On the face of it, he is like a kind of romantic ethnic nationalist talking about this ego of the nation that transcends the people. He uses that kind of language. But in my view, as I said, he only uses it because it enables him to say something that he wants to say to the people. It doesn't mean, in my view, that there is some mysterious metaphysical entity called the spirit of the Jewish people.
And maybe partly because he is rooted in the empirical understanding of the scientific and natural world. Yeah.
Exactly. So I think it's poetic more than anything and rhetorical, but not theoretical. That language of the ego of the nation. There's a disagreement, I think, between me and some of the Ahad Ha'am scholars who know more about him than I do.
I want to ask you about the editing process of this book.
Yeah.
There's a collection of about a dozen essays.
11. Well, 12 if you include mine.
Yeah, okay. Of course, Hadam was a very prolific writer, as we all know.
Yeah.
Why did you choose those and not others?
Well, first of all, I was limited to the essays translated into English by Leon Simon because my Hebrew isn't good enough to read him in the original, unfortunately. But on the other hand, the translations by Leon Simon in a way form a corpus in themselves because most people in the Anglophone world know Ahad Ha'am through Leon Simon's translations. Leon Simon was a friend and disciple of Ahad Ha'am. He was English. So that already limited things. I couldn't take in those essays that hadn't been translated. Then I just read as many, I think all actually, of the essays that had been translated. And I made this selection because I wanted to, for a couple of reasons. First of all, because I wanted to, going back to where we began, show him to be a kind of universal voice, to have something to say to the world in general. And this was what the publisher wanted. They asked me if I would do that, but I also wanted it. So it was a kind of agreement from the beginning. And partly because I wanted to cover certain... I wanted to be sure that the scope of the essays that I chose was not exactly representative, but broad enough to give people a sense of his territory in which he worked. And I only understood what this was the other day when I reread the essays, because you suggested this interview, and I discovered that if I were to edit the book now, I would arrange them in a different order.
Mm-hmm. Which order and why?
Well, rereading them, it seems to me that there are three major headings, if you like, or subheadings that the essays fall into. They overlap, and that's nice. The first is Judaism and justice, the nature of Judaism and the centrality of justice to it.
Going back to that first quote that I had at the beginning.
Exactly. This is so much at the heart of what he was about and why he connected the particular fate of the people, the Jewish people, to the universal fate of humankind. And that for him was different. That's why it's a strange nationalism. It's not a normal nationalism in a way. Because this ego... Is
there any normal nationalism?
Well, is there. That I'll leave to others to comment on. But as far as this one goes, it's not, again... My point being, I suppose, that it's not simply an application to the Jewish case of a general theory of nationalism. It's rather going into Jewish sources, and especially prophetic sources, from Moses in throughout the Tanakh to all the later prophets as well. That's one theme: Judaism and justice. Then the old and the new, the past and the present, with the future in mind. This is another current running through so many of the essays, and I'd be more than happy to talk about that in a moment, if you are interested. And then thirdly, it's Zionism. Political questions about the future of Palestine and the future of the diaspora, Jews living in the rest of the world. The 11 essays fall neatly under those three headings, I realize now. And so I think I must have been guided probably at the time by those three themes without even really knowing it.
I want to go back, getting into, again, some of the material in those essays. And because you've given us a segue to understand more about the application of his thinking to what Israel is today, I have to ask, from the essay Words of Fire, okay, he describes the three stages of a nation's life, right? A sort of young stage of the nation, a middle-aged part of the nation, where the nation is sort of more more self-reflective and clear-eyed and can understand its past self-critically, or the old stage, which he describes as a beginning of kind of a degenerate stage, where something negative happens to the nation's self. Where do you think Israel is today, or where do you think Echad Ha'am would say Israel is today?
Well, that's tricky. First of all, let me just say that there isn't an essay as such called Words of Fire. It's a phrase that he uses. It's okay. It's a phrase that he uses in one of the essays. I think it's Priest and Prophet, when he's describing the prophet speaking words of fire. And then that struck me as a good phrase to use as a title. To some extent, it applies to him.
The vagaries of reading online.
Yeah.
But, I should know. I know what you're referring to, and I can't remember which essay it's in. As I warned you beforehand, my memory is rather poor. But anyway, to come to your question about Israel today, it's always difficult, I think, to second guess what the dead think. If they weren't dead, what would they say today? Who knows? I mean, I can respond to your question, but I wouldn't want to make my response sound as though it's a kind of prediction of what Aham would have said if he would have
Or maybe as you
been
understand
alive.
what he meant by that phrasing, how would you see where Israel is now based on your interpretation of how he sees the three stages of a nation?
I think Aham would see Israel as being in a kind of crisis from a Jewish point of view, from that point of view. Because for him, the whole point of the movement was revival or rebirth of the nation, where that means recovering the spirit, as he called it. This is the word he uses a lot, which is why he's sometimes called, his ideas are sometimes called spiritual Zionism rather than cultural Zionism. Because he saw the movement in those terms, as revival of that spirit, and because he saw that spirit as precisely lying in speaking for justice against strength, against force. There's several essays in which he makes this point very, very strongly, that's what Judaism means from the beginning. When he criticizes Berdichevsky and the young Nietzscheans who want Judaism somehow to enter the modern world, how by giving up its kind of prophetic message and just seeking to impose itself, he's very critical of that view. And I think, I don't want to open up something we can't follow up in a short interview, but I think, therefore, this would be a reason for Baha'u'llah to see Israel today in a kind of spiritual crisis.
Mm-hmm. Do you think there's, in Israel and elsewhere in the world, there's someone who is an Echad-Ha'amist, a standard bearer of his ideas, whether it's today or after his death, other than Brian Klug?
You said in Israel. You're in Israel right now, but you will not be in a few days.
That's right. So I take it you mean someone more permanent in Israel. Also, I should clarify that I don't necessarily follow Echad Ha'am down the road that he goes.
But you do by being critical.
Well, that's an interesting way of putting it. In that sense, that's true. I certainly admire him as a critic, but also not only as a critic, but also as a kind of prophet, as a voice for something like the sort of Judaism that I myself subscribe to on the basis of my own Orthodox education and upbringing.
But now you raise such an interesting point, because you say that he's a sort of a prophet, and Gilad was asking if there is a standard bearer of I almost said Ginsburg, of Echad Ha'am. Maybe we're really asking, is there a prophet in Israel today?
Well, I see, putting the two things
together.
If there is, he may be hiding, or she may be hiding her light behind a bushel. I don't know. There are figures whom I personally admire more than others on the Israeli political scene.
Doesn't have to be politics.
Yeah, it doesn't have to be politics.
It doesn't have to be politics.
I mean, yes, someone who just adheres to Echad Ha'am's understanding of Zionism.
I tell you, when you ask this question of me, I become aware of how ignorant I am of the Israeli scene, and I don't feel equipped, therefore, to
Let's expand it to the Jewish world. And you know what? Why stop there? Is there anybody in the world today that you see as representing this kind of humanist, national, understanding the nation, humanist, universalist, focus on justice, self-critical?
Well, maybe I can, if I can, because I find it hard to answer that question directly, but maybe I can hook something onto the question by bringing myself back into the equation. Because one of you said something like, other than me, right? And I then started to step back and say, well, I don't necessarily follow him. And maybe, if I could just expand on that a little, it may produce or generate a kind of answer. The reason why I say that is because Echad Ha'am, first of all, I see his project as cultural Judaism, ultimately. and rather than cultural Zionism. That's to say, for him, it's the restoration or revival or renewal of Judaism and the Jewish people. And then he thought that could only happen if there was a permanent center in Palestine that was a generative center, culturally and spiritually speaking, for Jews all around the world. Well, I'm not convinced that in our day and age that's necessarily the case. We live in a different world from the world that existed in his day. I can well understand why he said that, and if maybe I would have been an Ahad Ha'amite had I been around in those days. As I said earlier, that was a world of ethnic nationalisms that were growing up everywhere, and there wasn't room for anyone else. That was the so-called Jewish question in Europe. That's why there was that question. It's what it meant. How do Jews fit into this map of ethnic nationalisms? We're living in a different world today. I'm not sure what world we'll live in tomorrow, given what's happened in the last 6 months or so. But nonetheless, it is a different world, and I don't myself, therefore, go along with the idea that there has to be a centre here. But the point is this. Ahad Ha'am never advocated the ingathering of the exiles. He explicitly speaks against this, actually. And he speaks, when he discusses the whole idea of the negation of the diaspora, which is generally regarded as a kind of central Zionist thesis or doctrine, he distinguishes between two senses here of negation. One is negation in the sense of regretting the deprivation and impoverishment of national life, if you like, in the world, that Judaism has suffered, on the one hand. On the other hand, that he thinks no one can deny, though even that can be disputed, actually, but nonetheless. And then he goes on to talk about another kind of negation, which is saying there is no future for Jews outside of their own state. And he rejects that in two ways. First of all, because he believes there is a future for Jews around the world. And in fact, for him, that's one of the main functions of his Zionism.
Because it's spiritual.
Because it's spiritual, and because the point of the center is to radiate to the periphery.
You know, this makes me think we have a real tension here between Israel today, which represents Temple Judaism, and Ahad Ha'am, who represents Yavne.
That's interesting. That's really interesting. Gosh, I hadn't thought about that before.
Not have I.
But
We've got to wrap up, so let's snap to it in 30 seconds.
Of course, it's Yavne mutatis mutandis. not necessarily the original
Yes,
Yavne.
exactly.
Or not Yavne today.
And not Yavne today.
Not Yavne today,
either.
definitely not Yavne
But
today.
actually, I don't want to stop you from putting further firing questions.
No,
at me.
we have to wrap up.
Okay, but can I just respond to that point? Because for him, this is why I resonate to Ahad Ha'am. Because for him, his project is precisely Yavne mutatis mutandis. He does not reject the tradition. He does not cast it off. In some ways, he's a conservative. He, by the way, is very critical of Reform Judaism. He's a defender of the Shulchan Aruch and the Talmud, but not as documents by which Jews should live today. His point is, these were expressions of the spirit of the people that were appropriate in the time. We should not diss them. We should not reject them. We should understand what they were and now go back to the wellspring from which Joseph Caro and drew, for example, with Shulchan Aruch and the rabbis in the Talmud. And now we have to, in a way, almost reinvent Judaism for our own day and age.
All right, Dr. Brian Klug, I'm afraid this is all we have time for today.
Which is tragic.
Which is very tragic. Thank you very much for coming in today. You're a Senior Research Fellow in Philosophy at St. Benet's Hall, University of Oxford, and the editor of the new book, Words of Fire, Selected Essays of Ahad Ha'am. Thank you very much.
The book is available online through the website of Notting Hill Editions, the publisher, whose website address is
NottingHillEditions.com.
I think it's NHE, I'm not sure, but maybe it's
But I'm sure Google
Editions.
could be of assistance here.
Yeah.
So anyway, Brian, thank you very much for
Thank you so much
joining
for
us.
being on the show.
Toda rabah. Thank you very much.
And also a big thanks to Tammy Goldenberg, our sound engineer, and to the Van Leer Institute for their generous support. If you like this podcast, and we know you all loved this podcast, there are many more where it came from. Just go to www.tlv1.fm/podcasts and take your pick. Don't forget to visit our new website, telavivreview.org. Like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, and every other possible social media. Join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, goodbye.